And we came up with, at the time, what I think of as both sort of like the very expansive, maybe grandiose idea for Substack, which is a new economic engine for culture. It is actually in the business model. It's in the social contract. And I might actually say the core of it is, what does the network know how to value? The problem, to my mind, with some of the sort by engagement stuff is those networks know how to value your time, but they don't know how to value what you value. I think a free press is fundamental to a free society. We've been through multiple periods where that drew a lot of heat and not everybody agreed with that stance. I've officially lived long enough where the polarity of people who are mad at me is mostly flipped. It becomes interesting to ask, what properties do you want from epistemic infrastructure? And one thing that I think is really important is independence. This is the lesson of blogging. Somebody is wrong on the internet is the greatest force for discourse.
Hello, everybody. My name is Patrick McKenzie, better known as Patio 11 on the internet. I'm here with Chris Best, who is the CEO of Substack.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much for coming on the program. So normally on this podcast, we talk about infrastructure, and I sort of slot Substack in as infrastructure for thought and thought leadership, which is near and dear to my heart, even though I'm not personally a person that uses the platform. But for the 5 listeners of this audience who don't know yet, what is Substack?
Substack is a media network where you can publish independently and connect directly with your audience.
And in the grand history of time on publishing on the internet, I see Substack as something of an evolution of, there was blogging for a while, and then there was social media, which was originally called microblogging. And Substack sort of stepped into a bit of a market niche where we have had ways for people to publish on the internet in some form factor for a while, but there was not really a business model associated with it. And Substack popularized that business model to both sides of the market, I think, both to particular subsectors of the employed population on the notion of you should spend much more on a Substack-shaped thing than you do currently, but also to public intellectuals in the likes of, you can name drop any that you want, but I think of people like, Matt Iglesias or Bernd Hobart, or across a wide range of fields, politics, commentary. The finance and tech were early large adopters of Substack as a model, both on the demand and supply side.
Scott Alexander's wonderful.
Scott Alexander, yes.
Paul Krugman has a Substack now. That's very exciting.
I think there was, for a while, it seemed like every few weeks there was someone that was quitting a prestige media desk to open their own Substack. And now sometimes the flow even goes in the other direction, where it's the free press, I think, that is getting. They announced an acquisition by CBS this week, if I remember right.
There's at least a very strong rumor of a very large acquisition of the free press.
And it's been interesting to see, and interesting that we've had newsletters for a very long time in the world. They predate the internet, actually, but
including paid newsletters.
Paid newsletters as well. And there was no obvious platform to do that in recent history. And then Substack made such a splash for it that it has almost become synonymous with the form factor. So much so that many people say, "Oh, I love your Substack," where I do not factually have one.
But we can fix that if you want. It is these things are remediable.
Yeah, my producer just won his bet with me that would be mentioned at some point. But be that as it may, what's your perception for why that worked? Why Substack successfully made this two-sided marketplace happen?
You hit the nail on the head when you sort of said the business model is the thing. And a big part of the reason that we did it is because that's what we set out to do. At the very beginning of the company, I was actually born from an essay that I was trying to write that never ended up being very good. That was kind of like bemoaning the state of the media economy on the internet. Basically making this point saying, hey, the internet has come along. It successfully killed a lot of the business models that used to support great media, great culture. And the thing that it has replaced it with in the first iteration, we had this kind of great land grab for attention. And the business model that has been phenomenally successful for the companies that use it and has powered a lot of wonderful social platforms that throw off a lot of value has kind of this fundamental flaw where the incentives that the business model imposes on the company, and then the company then imposes on their network, creates basically a bad mimetic evolutionary landscape.
Mhm.
And so these networks that we're all spending our time on are driving us nuts.
Mhm. This is sort by engagement is one of the original sins, I think, of and it's not just specific to social media. I think you can see the same pathology, and you don't need a capital A algorithm to make it happen. Even if you just have a web forum where the post that has the most recent comment is at the top, you will see the same dynamic. The more people get mad, the more comment on the thread with people getting mad, the more successful posters are selected for being able to drive people insane, et cetera, et cetera.
100%. And it's, and in the old news business, they used to say, if it bleeds, it leads, or, if you want to draw a crowd, start a fight. These things are reflections of fundamental facts about people. But then when you take those same facts about people and make it so powerful
Mhm.
and so global, and you can kind of like, you make the attention economy so efficient, you can kind of like get new levels of things.
Mhm.
Anyway, wah, complain, goes this dumb essay I'm trying to write. Send to my friend Hamish, who let me down very gently. He's like, dude, we know. Everybody, it's 2017. The idea that maybe the newspaper business is in trouble and maybe, Facebook is not an unalloyed good is hardly a new idea. But the more interesting question is, let's assume that all of that is true. What could you do about it? How could it be different? And it was from that question that we actually started arguing and figuring out. And we came up with, at the time, what I think of as both sort of like the very expansive, maybe grandiose idea for Substack, which is a new economic engine for culture.
Mhm.
Which is, if you want to actually fix that problem, the answer is not in the product or in the technology or in the company. It is actually in the business model. It's in the social contract. And so if you want to ultimately make something that unlocks a lot of new value and solves some of those problems, it has to be built on a different foundational assumption. And I might actually say the core of it is, what does the network know how to value?
Mhm.
The problem, to my mind, with some of the sort by engagement stuff is those networks know how to value your time, but they don't know how to value what you value.
Mhm.
And so if you spend your time on something that cheaply grabs your eyes or makes you angry, from the network's point of view, that's just as good as if you read a really life-changing essay that leaves you nourished and smarter. And to you, those are very different things.
Mhm.
But to the network, and it's not that there's like mustachio twirling villains that think, haha, it's just when you set up those incentives, when it can't value what you value, it's so much cheaper and easier and a shorter path to make the short engagement stuff. So you have to create a new business model. So that's what sort of philosophically we set out to do. And so the fact that we were deliberately trying to do that thing and setting up long range plans in order to let ourselves do it, I think contributed to our ability to succeed. We also started, we had the big vision and we had the MVP idea,
Mhm.
right? We'd saw what Andrew Sullivan did with the Daily Dish. We'd seen what Ben Thompson had done with Stratechery. There was kind of this interesting model that we felt, the paid email newsletter was kind of a potential kernel of that new model. He said, hey, anybody on the internet can go and subscribe to this thing. Your incentive as the writer is to earn and keep the trust of people who deeply value what you're doing rather than merely to draw a crowd. You want to retain them, you want to provide value. The fact that you can do this on the internet and you can do it to a global audience means that if you have even a relatively small audience that deeply values it, the economic proposition can be very strong in a way that it's hard to do on these things. And so the idea of making it dead simple to create a paid email newsletter became the early kernel of what even I confess think of as a Substack now, which is, making one of these kind of independent publications.
Yeah. And I think retrospectively, a paid email platform is not exactly rocket science, but for the typical person who's setting up a Substack, Ben Thompson at Stratechery can either himself or through engaging a Rails programmer get a fairly competent thing stood up. But the typical person working in a newsroom, that might as well be on the moon for them.
It was so hard. And we called them up. We're like, hey, Ben, like you're writing an email newsletter from your bedroom in Taiwan, making millions of dollars. Why does everybody not do this? This seems amazing. He's like, I don't know why everybody doesn't do it. It's so great. All you have to do is set up your memberful, connect it to your WordPress, like invent your own business model, glue these integrations together, do it for 6 months without making any money. Like, he sort of like detailed all the things that he did to make it happen. And we were like,
Rails programmers are abundant in the world. It's only a, $7,000 a week charge out rate for an intermediate one. Yeah. And it makes it very difficult for people to get over that hump between having 0 words written on the internet and 1 paying customer for it.
Yes. And I imagine this is something that comes up in a lot of infrastructure things, like the activation energy really matters.
Yeah.
Right. The idea of doing this thing, the idea of starting a Substack was so weird and so new that even though it was actually a good idea for a lot of people, how much energy they had to try it at the start was very low. And we had to lower the barrier and make it really easy and simple, and like one person could do it. And then once you did that, it unlocked a lot of things, and then that created examples, and then it made other people think that they could do it. But you had to like take all of this power of technology and like put it in people's hands in a very simple way to have any hope of the thing going.
I think one of the interesting things you did in the early days, and I'm not sure if it is an active program, but was probably pretty important for getting sort of the lighthouse writers early, was the revenue guarantee that you offered. Do you want to briefly discuss the mechanics of that back in the day?
That was a program we had for a little while, several years ago. And there was a period of time where there was some people we would talk to, and we'd seen enough Substack launches that we were like, this thing is really working. And there are some people in the world where we just know. And I think, Matt Iglesias has been public about his version of this because he was one of the people. So I'll talk about the things that he's made public. But we're kind of like, Matt, you're going to make so much money on Substack. You should definitely do this. And you're kind of, I think he had been quit or pushed out of the media company that he founded at this point. And he got to the point where he's like, you're right. I'm very excited about this. This sounds amazing. I really want to do it. But, I got to cover my bills while I do it. Like, how much risk am I taking? And so we had a construct that we used for a little while that basically kind of like set a floor for the first year. And we just said, okay, for the first year, you're going to make at least this much. And then if you make way more than that, we're going to actually keep some of the upside. But if you make less, we're going to protect the downside. And then in year, 2 and further, it's going to revert to the standard Substack deal, which is free to publish. We take 10% of subscriptions. And that, unlocked for Matt and for some other people, like he came and just smashed through all of the minimums, and we actually made a huge amount of money for underwriting that deal in the first year. And I think at the time it was really important because people hadn't had enough examples to kind of know that they were going to be able to do it. And we could lend them our confidence that it was going to work in a way that sort of like unlocked and provided some activation energy.
I think it was also important for sort of crossing the chasm between the bloggers in bathrobes phase and the being seen as a like serious competitive option to working in a high status New York journalism publication or similar. Not that Substack is monomaniacally focused on either journalism or commentary, but for people who could otherwise be working at, say, the New York Times or a similar publication, it took a while for this to be as well understood in New York as it is understood by people in the tech industry. But it seemed obviously the case even 4 or 5 years ago that the existence of Substack as an option for people that had some level of personal brand, some level of writing ability, and something interesting to say fundamentally transforms the economics of media in that if you are the star columnist at the New York Times, wonderful, the word is your oyster. If you are the 40th most popular columnist at the New York Times, you should probably be on Substack.
And it transforms it even for the people that don't quit. There are people who negotiate much larger salaries for themselves because they know they have the option that they could do a Substack, and so does their employer.
I am aware of 1 or 2 of those people, and I'm very glad both for you and for them that Substack is the the batnet that it is right now.
In those days, I used to go and give people a little speech to get them to do Substack. And I was like, here's what you care about. You really care about freedom, money, and prestige. I cannot offer you prestige. But the other two, you're going to have so much more freedom and make so much more money. And it was great. It is great to be able to offer people that.
To what degree do you think it is true that you can't offer prestige anymore? Because when I look at the sort of people that are either joining Substack as entrepreneurs or joining Substack publications as writers now that have a payroll that is larger than the person that originally founded them, I see people who, very credibly have other options in prestige journalism or in other intellectual spheres. So, for example, Kelsey Piper, recently of Vox now joined The Argument, which is, I believe, a Substack publication.
I do think that is changing. I think, if you look back in 2020, that was definitely, it was true that it was not prestigious. You mentioned blogging, and people used to say to me in a really accusatory tone, they would say, Substack is just blogging with a business model. And I was like, that's no small thing. Forget actually, that was the main problem with blogging. Blogging was great. And the lack of a business model was sort of the fatal flaw.
I think both of us have been around the internet for a while, and sometimes people cast back to the golden age of blogging, and why don't people write like that on the internet anymore? And I'm like, well, if you remember back, the people who you most loved from that age, most of them are still with us, and they've just taken career upgrades as a result of what they were doing back in the day. And now Substack is one path for those career upgrades.
Definitely. And I do think the prestige is coming. It's maybe not full on prestige, but I do think there's a sense of intellectual ferment that's starting to develop. I know I read Derek Thompson's post about coming to Substack. And one of the things he said was he was just reading Substack. He's just going to, that's where the conversations that he is finding intellectually stimulating are happening. And you're sort of feeling a little bit on the outside and feeling like, hey, sort of regardless of whether this is prestigious or whether this is whatever, it's kind of like, this is where the interesting stuff is happening. I think that's powerful.
I think one of the reasons I made the joke that there's probably only 5 people in the audience who aren't exposed to it yet is, one, the Substack URL is everywhere if you are working in policy or reading commentary or similar. 2, it is genuinely a part of the conversation. Kelsey mentioned to me yesterday when we were recording an interview that she has been happy in the brief couple of weeks that the argument has been up, that it is getting responses from, people at the usual suspects, and that they are, relating to the argument as peers in the same way that they would relate to her at her old publication as a peer and a member of the discourse, as it were. And took a while to get there, as these things do. I remember there was a time not so long ago where the word platform was both a noun and a verb a lot, and it was not monomaniacally popular that you would give people a business model on the internet. I seem to remember that there was some discontent about having right-wingers like Matt Iglesias having the ability to make money by writing things online. And you folks took some unpopular stances on that in the 2020-21 timeframe, and they seem to largely have worked out.
We, from very early on, took quite a strong stance in favor of freedom of the press as we see it. We think, hey, it's the right thing for our business and our platform. Partly, we designed our business and our platform in a way because that's what we believe in. I think a free press is fundamental to a free society. And we've been through multiple periods where that drew a lot of heat and not everybody agreed with that stance. It's happened. I always knew this would happen, but I've officially lived long enough where the polarity of people who are mad at me is mostly flipped. And we're starting to see, kind of the inverse of some of the arguments we were having back then come to fruition now. But I just think it's something that really matters. And I'm proud that we've been able to kind of consistently push that thing. My experience has been, there are relatively few consistent defenders of the free press, the freedom of the press, I should say. Whoever's out of power it sort of has the convenient thing of saying, we need to have this freedom, and then whoever's in power has this temptation to wield the power to advantage their side. But I think it's a valuable and important thing that we can do.
I think the acknowledgement of an ad read sounds cooler in Japanese. この番組は次のスポンサーの提供でお送りします。Cool, right?
This podcast is brought to you by Mercury. As many listeners are aware, I love a good bit of banking. I even enjoy the sucky, frustrating bits of working with large banks, because I'm broken. You know who isn't broken? Mercury, which offers business banking services to 200,000 companies, including mine. I've used them for business banking for more than 6 years and been quite happy for the duration. Everything happens in a well-designed website and mobile app. I use them for the debit card that pays for the studio rental, for paying myself profits, and for transferring money to contractors. I even use them for wires to angel investments, and I've never gone through an involved rigmarole over a single one. And, wouldn't you know it, most of those wires go to other Mercury customers. Mercury works well for businesses at a variety of stages and industries, from quickly growing funded startups to this relatively tiny internet publishing operation. Visit Mercury.com to apply online in 10 minutes. Mercury is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided through Choice Financial Group, Column NA, and Evolve Bank and Trust, members FDIC.
So your co-founder, Hamish McKenzie, no relation by the way, had a point in an essay a few years ago that the production function for journalism had been changed by the use of Twitter as a product specifically, and that reporters are spending so much of their time with their coworkers, their sources, their bosses, and also political activists on Twitter. And that conversation was getting even more incestuous than the Brooklyn media landscape usually is. And I think that caused a decrease in the range of acceptable opinions in both the pages of media and in the ranks of the people that made it up. And I think that might have been one of the reasons why there was such pressure against Substack for the free speech stance. And free speech has many defenders these days. Seems like should be a vacuous statement for the United States of America, but felt like it wasn't for a few years. And I think you're being vindicated for some choices made back in the 2020 and 2021. And it's important to remember that those were not super popular choices everywhere in the world back in those years.
Well, thank you. That means a lot. Maybe an interesting take on that is, if you're thinking of Substack as epistemic infrastructure, if only because that's the theme of the podcast, it becomes interesting to ask, what properties do you want from epistemic infrastructure? And one thing that I think is really important is independence, is the idea that, if you have an opinion or a point or a view that's your own, that's outside of the consensus or outside of whatever else may be going on, that you still have the ability to make that case and, do that thing. And you have part of that is just having the freedom to actually be allowed to say something that may be unpopular or maybe, people don't want to hear. But part of it is also, is there a countervailing reward for being out of consensus but right, or even just being out of consensus but interesting, which can also be very valuable. And I think one way that your epistemic infrastructure can fail is if the punishment for independence starts to exceed the reward too uniformly. You can trigger kind of like a Overton window collapse. And I think that we've seen that dynamic play out a few times in different parts of with different ideological and political valences. And we deserve epistemic infrastructure that has more robust support for independence.
Yep. I think one of the implicit weapons that was used during the cancel culture years was that not only might you lose your current job if there was a sufficient number of people on Twitter sufficiently annoyed at you, but due to the perception that you were damaged goods and the somewhat incestuous nature of various industries, you might be effectively blacklisted from the field.
Your career might be over.
Yeah. And it didn't require, Joseph McCarthy in putting you on a list of names, because the relevant parties already had you on a Twitter list or a blacklist or whatever you want to call it. And the existence of Substack on if one, we're not discussing people who are beyond the pale of polite society. If you have a point of view that there is a market for, then Substack is a place that you will be able to take that market. And so even if you are pushed out of the media company that you co-founded over no real reason, or even if you have discovered that a certain prestige media organization thinks that you are no longer reliable with respect to the house line, you have the option of going to Substack and taking your audience with you. That both improves the discourse on Substack and the broader internet, but it also improves the discourse at the traditional media outlets, because their reporters don't have to be afraid anymore.
That's right.
Not to the degree that they previously were.
The same way that you can, if you're a great columnist, you can get a raise even if you don't go to Substack.
Mhm.
You can be afforded a little bit more freedom even if you don't go to Substack for that reason, because there isn't, the ability to gatekeep the range of what people say is lessened.
Mhm.
And yeah, you sort of said, even if that happens, you can go on Substack. If we're being real, there's a little bit of especially if. I think one of the dynamics that happened was the people that provoked the strongest response. The model was able, that motivated people to subscribe.
Mhm.
And you had these moments of like, here's something that I value, that I'm interested in, or here's somebody that I've been following. And they, this is valuable to me. And this is a place and a model where I'm going to be able to get that, and I'm going to be able to support them. It provides this countervailing force where, as the pressures pushing against independent voices get stronger, there's kind of a countervailing reaction from the audience where they can say, no, I actually really want this.
Mhm. And I think the changing the strategic calculus of that was probably healthy for the discourse by making quote unquote cancel culture, or the scripts that made up cancel culture, less of a super weapon. When you know that, if you engage in the usual set of behaviors, you will not succeed in making it impossible for someone to put food on the table, but probably just get them a raise when they open up their Substack next week, then there will be less undisciplined use of it as a tool of punishment and a tool of discourse, versus like the more salubrious uses of discourse of, oh, well, if there's someone on the internet that we disagree with strongly, we should probably publish our disagreement in a reasoned format to our own spaces, and then life will be grand.
This is the lesson of blogging. Somebody is wrong on the internet is the greatest force for discourse.
Someone is wrong on the internet has created so much value in the world. We should urgently hope that there are more people wrong on the internet next year.
We're working
on the internet this year. Yeah. And I think, this is not a politically partisan podcast, but I think there's some understanding in certain parts of the aisle where the understanding was less a few years ago that one can't simply afford to cede the internet to the only people willing to show up to it. And some discourse in, the Democratic Party and similar on, well, how do we move forward here now that the political winds do not seem to be in our favor? You mentioned Derek Thompson earlier, and the abundance movement that he's kicked off with the book and similar. And partly that's a reconfiguration of the sort of existing coalition management for that party. Partly it's a argument that we had a very narrow range of acceptable options here, and now we have a new shelling point for places in that range, and that new shelling point is now on Substack.com.
And there's also an interesting, there's a question of what's acceptable range. There's also a question of what degree of depth and nuance does the format reward.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the things that makes me crazy about writing for the traditional media, because they'll say, yes, we love everything you have to say, and if you can confine it to 800 words, please, once, and maybe we'll revisit it in 3 years. That would be great.
That can be tough. I also think, some of the social networks, you're compressing things so small, which is powerful, but it creates sort of an incentive landscape for the fittest ideas rather than the truest ideas, or sort of the compression can pull things out. And so in a world where more and more people are able to be on Substack, there's a wide, both Gavin Newsom and the State Department started a Substack this year. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad for that. I think that's going to be, they'll be able to expand their ideas at length. They'll be able to have people disagree with them on the internet. And the more that that works, the more that different parts of our politics, parts of our world of ideas can live in that sort of space, I think it will have salutary effects.
Yeah. Certainly can't imagine a world in which one would prefer 15-second sound bites on one's network of choice versus a reasoned multi-page argument for the correct way to conduct policy.
We'll have both. 15-second, the fact that the 15-second sound bites are going to continue to exist, that's locked in. But it was a question if we would get the essays.
Yep.
And now we're going to get them. And I think that really matters. Even if the audience for it is relatively small in number, I think that wields outsized influence in the world of ideas.
Yeah, I think we live in a democracy where very many people participate, and that is wonderful. And many people will participate to an attenuated degree by catching in the 15 seconds and being undecided about their vote in the election until the day before. And then there's a political elite that has always been with us and is largely responsible for the production of culture and the 8,000-word essays dueling in the pages of the newspaper and similar, maybe 800 in the newspaper, but I like 8,000 words. 8,000 words is a fine length for a short essay. We have the internet available. We don't have strict character limits. There's no finite number of column inches. And so we should fill the internet to the extent possible with what we want to do differently in the nation and the world and in the various potential possibilities for those futures. And then we should give people an informed choice between them. We mentioned that Substack originally started as the newsletter platform, but you've brought in a bit as a product, including into podcasts, as I understand it. And do you want to talk a little bit about the other form factors that Substack supports these days?
Yeah. When we started this new economic engine for culture, the idea was never, this is only going to be text. We started with text and writing because that's kind of who we were, and we felt this was the right place to go. We actually built the initial support for podcasting pretty early. And in some ways, a podcast is pretty analogous to an email newsletter, right? You have this direct connection through having someone's email or having the podcast feed that goes into an app they already use. We also started working on video several years ago, but video never used to work for us because people don't usually watch video from their email. But now we have the Substack app, and there's an increasing number of people who are coming to the Substack app to keep up with their subscriptions, to discover new things. And sort of the podcasting and the video stuff is really starting to work. And there's kind of a new, we talked about one of the things that Substack did in the early days was take a set of technologies and capabilities that already existed in theory and make it easy enough that many more people, lowering the activation energy so many more people can do it in practice. The way I sometimes would jokingly say this to people is, look, we're going to do everything for you except the hard part. It's really hard to write an essay that's interesting enough that a lot of people are going to read it, let alone pay for it. But if you can do that, we should take care of absolutely everything else. You should be able to come and type into this box. And if the things you type are great, you'll get rich and famous. And we made a lot of progress on that thing. That thing is true to a degree now. And I think we now have the opportunity to do something similar in video and podcasting, in part because of the AI revolution that's happening. We have the ability to do podcasting. You could easily and should consider taking the podcast episodes that you record and putting them on Substack so that they can be distributed and for free and take advantage of all the nice things. And you get discovery and people can come and pay, all of the Substack things. That stuff works. It's really great. But the startup costs for doing a podcast are still pretty high. And so we have this new feature that I'm very excited about called Substack Live. And what it is you can have a conversation that feels like a FaceTime call. So you pull out your phone, you're just talking to somebody like a video call, and people can watch live if they want to. It can also automatically upgrade the quality of your video and audio. It can automatically create an edited podcast. It can automatically create a YouTube video. It can automatically create a series of social media clips that work for you. It will soon be able to automatically do Star Trek translation into every language. And so we're kind of working on doing for video the same thing we did for text, which is say, we're going to do everything for you except the hard part. And so we have people that, are famous TV anchors who are now doing the same thing that those columnists were doing back in the day and realizing that they can have their own studio in the palm of their hand and show up and have a conversation and have their thing work. And I just think it's very exciting and fun.
So I think people who have been involved in the production function of media don't understand that there might be one person on camera, there might be one person who is credited in a byline, but they often have a team behind them. And there could be a producer, an editor, a transcriptionist, et cetera, all involved in the production of a simple podcast. And one of the things that AI brings to the table is, again, if there is one person with interesting ideas to spread, then maybe you can make the minimum number of people required to have a publication on the internet just the one.
Which especially matters at the start for the activation energy.
Yeah.
Like, it's how many interesting conversations and interesting things never get started just because there's enough cost to get going that you can't overcome it.
Yeah. And how many businesses don't get off the ground and don't get to the point where they can afford to hire somebody. I am a little bit quirky on that one, but it took me many more than 10 years until my blog was in the position to have someone permanently attached to it, which it does these days. Thank goodness. I'm glad I don't have to do all my own work, even if I continue to do all my own writing. But when you get people to this point of, okay, can bring my base of fans, which I've developed through internet participation or previous engagements or similar, get them to be in the position where they're paying for things, enhance that with the AI tools and similar. And then maybe in the first month, maybe in the third month, hopefully not in the 10th year, they can bring on a full-time editor, bring on a transcriptionist, bring on a social media manager, et cetera, to start backfilling and applying some of the, the talent and taste that the AIs are wonderful, but they're not quite there yet for that sort of thing.
100%.
So you folks mentioned something a few years ago, which I thought is an excellent use of the network as an accelerant for everyone on the network, where there's this problem since forever in journalism. Occasionally, you write about the actions of the powerful or people who wish they were powerful, and occasionally powerful people take exception to that, and they have their lawyer send you a nastygram. And that is a terrifying prospect for someone who is independent. Can you talk a little bit about what Substack did to change that equilibrium?
Yeah, we noticed this was a reoccurring problem. And the place we noticed it especially was among local news coverage. There would be some local politician or local business person that would get covered in a way that was completely legitimate, but that they didn't like. And they would send this bogus nastygram. And the poor independent writer would go, how do I deal with this? And we felt that was the root cause there was kind of an asymmetry of costs. Like, it cost the powerful person very little to send a mean thing. And even if you were pretty sure it was bogus as the writer, that just the cost of even hiring your own lawyer, figuring out what you're going to do felt very high. And you didn't feel like you had it felt unsafe to impose costs back. It was hard to go back and say, look at this thing, look what they did.
There's often a lack of institutional support too, particularly for local journalists, where the business model has the challenges of the business model, and it is easier to move on to the next 5 column inches versus committing strongly to defend your journalists and their right to freedom of the press, like, say, a well-resourced institution like the New York Times would do. And so, there's potentially $50,000 of legal costs on the line here. We only pay you $50,000 a year. We're not going to take that amount of legal costs. Just avoid antagonizing this person, give them what they want, and never cover them again.
Totally. And to their credit, most of the good news organizations don't take that attitude. They say, we actually have to be able to report stuff. So we know that we have an interest in vigorously defending this stuff. But if you're independent, it's really tough. And so we started this program called Substack Defender that you can apply to. It still exists. It's gotten bigger and better over the years. And basically, we will, if you're accepted, foot the bill for some legal help that you need. And the biggest reason for us to do this was to flip that incentive structure, where if you're a person who's trying to silence a local reporter or somebody doing legitimate protected journalism, we as Substack can come in and make it very costly for you. We can hire a great lawyer. We can make a bunch of noise about it. We can kind of fix that problem, with the idea not being that we're going to have to infinitely fight every case like this, But if we can make it so that one of the things that might happen is that you get this vigorous defense from Substack, it makes people think twice in the first place, that it's not going to be so easy to push around some person that's just, trying to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's gone pretty well. We've picked up a bunch of cases, some of which we've won in very convincing fashion. And I think it's been it's something that I've been very proud that we've been able to do.
I love this because it's like insurance, but better. You're doing the fundamental insurance math of how many people are really going to get sued or nasty grammed in a given year. But I have media insurance, wonderful thing to get if one is sophisticated. And just FYI for the audience, it costs me about $3,000 a year. And if someone sues me, it's Warren Buffett on the line for defending me. And good luck trying to outspend him. But the incentive of an insurance company is you recruit a large book of business that doesn't get sued that often. And when you do get sued, the lawyers will stall for a little bit and then settle out. And Substack has a different incentive there, which is not simply settle out for 50 grand and let bygones be bygones, but actually make it symmetrically costly, maybe even asymmetrically costly. And look, the last 5 people who have sued us, it has not gone well. Would you like to be number 6? We would love to have another star on the wall.
The insurance company can't scare off the fires that they're insuring against. Mm-hmm. But to some extent, we can scare off the worst abuses of the nasty gram technique. And it's fun to be able to do that.
Yeah. And it is a thing that gets more powerful every time you do it. It gets more powerful with the size of the network. It gets more powerful as Substack is increasingly treated by the prestige press as a reasonable place for people who are in the prestige press to spend a few years out of their life. That, this is appear to people that matters. Do you really want to mess with them right now?
And people should know, if you're considering suing somebody on Substack, you should know that I personally take great pleasure in fighting these fights.
I am glad to hear that. And I think it really does matter. And another, just to shout out an unrelated company, Cloudflare has a thing like this where they go after patent trolls, where it's a similar patent trolls were scourged at the internet for a number of years just because of the asymmetry of it's only a few thousand or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands to settle. It's $1 million plus to really defend a lawsuit. And Cloudflare's like, no, commitment strategy. You come after us, your portfolio, we will burn it to the ground. And if you, not that you have to burn down the business model of being an annoying mayor or similar, I don't know if that's possible, but if you just credibly threaten, no, pushing us around will not work out well for you, then the number of people that try to resolve their differences through abuse of the legal system will be relatively lower. And you can say, look, if you have an argument with someone who is on Substack, there are many places on the internet that you can publish a response. We will give you one if you want.
Fantastic.
So do you have any parting thoughts for folks on where the internet and media economy are going over the next couple of years as you see it?
Maybe there's one point I'd like to make that I should have made earlier. We've talked about how the fundamental idea of Substack, the reason why we can bend it into being infrastructure for the purpose of this podcast is, we're creating this new incentive landscape. We're creating this new sort of business model and social contract. In the early days, we were really just a tool, and it was an easy way to get started, and you could push a button and lower the barrier to entry, and that was really good. One of the things we learned over time was it wasn't enough to only be a tool, because if you wanted to succeed on Substack and you were starting afresh and you didn't have an enormous audience, or you were, even if you had a big audience, but you want to grow and reach people, you also just had to go on every other network. Mm-hmm. And in a world where if you want to be good at Substack, you also have to be good at Twitter, there's a couple problems with that. One is, philosophically, you're still downstream of the incentive landscape of every other platform. Mm-hmm. Your top of funnel comes from the same kinds of things that are what works on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever you may be. Mm-hmm. And the other is
downstream of trust and safety and management decisions, trust and safety, like Twitter. And if people decide that links are something we hate this month, then your reach gets.
That's the other thing. Right? Like Mark Zuckerberg for a while decided he was going to deprioritize politics because he was mad about how the way he was treated after Cambridge Analytica. Mm-hmm. And if you're a politics writer, that's tough. And it's not necessarily against you, but that hits you, right? We got in a spat with Elon where he banned the word Substack for a week and then killed links forever. And so if you're you want to be this independent person, you still rely on kind of like the agglomeration effects of these networks. And so one thing that we've been building is a network. We have the Substack app now that you can download. You can go and subscribe and follow the things you actually, and you can go to substack.com the same way. You can follow, get the things you subscribe to, but also you can discover new things. And one of the benefits of being on Substack is you have this avenue for growing among this increasing audience of smart, interesting, higher propensity to pay people. And I think that thing is kind of the thing that we can give the world over the next little bit, a real alternative to the other networks, some of which are just in a pretty tough spot right now, I think.
And I think there is a bit of a flywheel effect here for the more writers you draw to Substack, the more readers you draw to Substack, the more credit cards you have on file on Substack, et cetera, et cetera. Not too dissimilar to like how the Apple Store solved like not just the payments problem, but having the installed user base at the same time, where contingent on someone being professionally involved in the life of the mind, it is increasingly likely that they have at least one Substack subscription, which makes it marginal friction of them adding a new Substack subscription is rather less than if they're coming in from the cold. And then you do the obvious things like make it easy for people to buy written work on the internet, which is more difficult than one would expect. Someone who spent a bit of time in payments infrastructure for a few years, but many things to appreciate about the model. And I wish you and the writers the best of luck and skill in, continuing to get interesting ideas out into the world and the discourse, and for the rest of the world in benefiting from them.
Thank you very much.
This seems like a vacuous question, but I have to ask it because I ask it every week. Chris, where can people find you on the internet?
So get the Substack app or go to substack.com if you haven't already. And I'm on there too. I have my personal Substack username CB.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And for the rest of you, thanks very much. And we'll see you next week on Complex Systems.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Complex Systems. If you have comments, drop me an email or hit me up at Patio11 on Twitter. Ratings and reviews are the lifeblood of new podcasts for SEO reasons, and also because they let me know what you like.